So, still talking about functions, now I'm going to talk also about arguments and parameters. These are two important concepts that we should definitely know how to differentiate. When we have our function definition right here, last session we saw how to do it. We just use def and the name of our function, and then arbitrarily you can select if you're going to use a parameter / argument or not. So in this case right here, we are saying that, hey, this function here, it's using two input data sources. So when we use the definition in our function, when we explicitly have the function name and then the input values, those input values right here, they are called parameters. But when we call our function, like if I say here, let's say something, and then I pass some arbitrary values there, let's say hi, and then the second value we can be just cake, why not? So the information that we are passing here to that function, these are called arguments. So at the function call time, the input value are called arguments, and the function definition we are talking about parameters. So in this case right here, we have the function, it was defined, and then we call our function there, and we have that arguments were hi and cake. Okay? One cool thing that we can do here in Python is you don't necessarily need to define a value or a position. So one thing that we can do here is we can say, hey, that function, it's going to have some default values. So here for A, it's going to assume the default value of 0, and then the B is going to assume the default value of 12. And what we mean by default value is if none arguments are passed over this function, then the default value, they're going to be triggered. So let's say we call the function, say something here, we already ran this. So we have a new signature for this function, and let's just call it. So as you can see, there's no arguments being passed, but even with that, we have the values of 0 and 12 being displayed for us, which is pretty cool, right? Because I can say, well, there is a specific task. If none information is passed, just use this as a default behavior. And this is pretty cool. You can also play around with this a little. For example, let's say just the B value, it's going to be using a default value. So let's say here we have mooncake. And let's run this function. And then let's call our function like and say something. And let's try not to pass anything just to see what happens. If we run this way, B has a default value, but A has none. So our function here say something is missing one required positional argument and even tells which argument is this. So in order to run this, we should pass at least one value, let's say 42 here, and that positional argument is going to be used into A. So if we try to run this here, now that we have one argument was 42, as we can see here for A, and since I didn't provide any other value, I can say that B here assumed the value of mooncake, and this is pretty cool, right? About default value and arguments in our functions, just take care, there are some rules about it. So if you have a default value, like for one argument, the next one here also has to have a default value. Otherwise, it will say, hey, a default value argument cannot be before a positional argument. Like in this case here, you see as the non-default argument follows a default argument. So this here should be in the opposite order, right? Let's run this again and let's do the following. Now let's redefine our function the way it was. And let's create some more cells and let's call this function again. And now instead of using the positional arguments, we can try to go there and do the following, that A is going to have a specific value and B is going to have a specific value. So we can have something like B equals 42, and then A it's going to be Bob. So now we are still using positional arguments, but we are specifying which arguments should receive each value, which is pretty cool, because even though they're not following the same order right here, their index or their parameter reference, it's telling which argument should go with which variable that we have here in our function definition, right? I guess that needless to say, if you just don't specify anything, let's say something, and we just pass the value, boom. If we try to run this, well, it's going to say that it's still missing one required positional argument. And this time here, the positional argument that is missing is B. Why? Because this value right here, this argument of boom, it was placed into A because it follows the natural order that you have your parameters. So it's still missing here the B argument for us. Okay? So if you don't specify anything, just you put the values directly, those values are going to be placed in the order that you have defined in your positional arguments for your functions. Okay, so thank you and happy coding.